Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. If you've subscribed for more stories, enjoy the ride now. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Nexus had been designed by someone who clearly believed that diplomacy worked better when everyone involved felt appropriately intimidated by the architecture. Crystalline columns stretched toward a vaulted ceiling that displayed real-time images of nebulae and distant star systems, while representatives from 23 worlds sat in carefully arranged tiers that managed to suggest both unity and the potential for immediate warfare. David Palmer stood in the back with the other members of Earth's diplomatic escort, trying to look professional while privately wondering how he'd ended up representing humanity at the most important political gathering in galactic history. As an emergency medical technician from Portland, Oregon, his usual responsibilities involved stabilizing trauma victims and arguing with hospital administrators about paperwork, not witnessing alien royalty select husbands in ceremonies that determined the balance of interstellar power. "Remarkable, isn't she?" whispered Ambassador Zhang, Earth's lead diplomat, as Queen Ashera of the Valerian Empire rose to address the assembly. David had to admit that remarkable was an understatement. Queen Ashera stood nearly 6 feet tall, her naturally silver hair flowing like liquid metal over armor that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight. Her eyes shifted between deep blue and violet depending on the angle of the light, and every movement carried the kind of unconscious authority that came from leading a warrior civilization through 8 years of successful campaigns against threats that most species preferred not to think about. "Representatives of the Galactic Council," the Queen began, her voice carrying easily through the vast hall without technological amplification, "I appear before you today not as a conqueror seeking expansion, but as a ruler seeking partnership." The formal language couldn't disguise the frustration in her tone, and David found himself genuinely curious about what had brought the galaxy's most feared military leader to what was essentially a very elaborate dating show. "The Valerian Accords require that I choose a consort whose courage matches my own in order to legitimize my continued rule," Queen Ashera continued. "For 6 months, warriors from across known space have competed for this honor through trials of strength, cunning, and tactical brilliance." She gestured toward a group of impressively muscled individuals who looked like they'd been designed by a committee dedicated to maximizing intimidation per square inch. David recognized several species from his diplomatic briefings: Chronarian berserkers whose idea of foreplay involved ritual combat, Altarian storm riders who courted death as a recreational activity, and at least 3 representatives from worlds where being polite was considered a sign of fatal weakness. "Each has demonstrated remarkable skill," the Queen said diplomatically, "but none has shown the specific form of courage that the Valerian people require in their future leader." One of the competitors, a 7-foot reptilian warrior whose scales seemed to absorb light, stepped forward with the kind of swagger that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through judicious application of violence. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice like grinding stone, "surely the trials have proven our worthiness. I myself have defeated champions from 12 worlds and demonstrated tactical superiority in 7 different combat scenarios." "Indeed, General Corvin," Queen Ashera replied, "you have proven yourself a formidable warrior. But courage in battle is only one form of bravery, and perhaps not the most important one for someone who would help lead a people toward a future that requires more than military victory." The confusion that followed this statement was visible throughout the assembly. David could see representatives from various worlds trying to process the concept that the leader of the galaxy's premier warrior race might be looking for something other than a partner who could break things efficiently. The formal ceremony continued with speeches from various dignitaries, each more elaborate and less informative than the last, until a commotion in the service corridor interrupted the proceedings. Through the partially open doors, David could see kitchen staff dealing with what appeared to be a serious accident involving scalding liquid and at least 3 people who needed immediate medical attention. David's training kicked in before his diplomatic obligations could object. He was moving toward the corridor before he'd consciously decided to leave his post, his emergency medical kit, which he'd brought out of habit rather than expectation, already in his hands. The scene in the kitchen was controlled chaos. 2 Altarian servers and 1 human catering assistant were suffering from severe burns caused by an overturned container of some kind of alien beverage that apparently heated itself to temperatures capable of melting most known materials. The kitchen supervisor was attempting to coordinate a response while simultaneously trying to prevent the situation from disrupting the ceremony, and everyone involved seemed to be operating under the assumption that someone else would handle the medical emergency. "Excuse me," David said, approaching the supervisor with the kind of calm authority he'd developed from years of arriving at accident scenes. "I'm a certified emergency medical technician. May I help?" The supervisor, a blue-skinned individual whose species David couldn't identify, looked at him with the expression of someone who'd just been offered a life preserver while drowning. "Are you qualified to treat multiple species?" "I've had xenobiology training," David replied, already assessing the injuries and mentally adjusting his treatment protocols. "Burns are burns, and pain is pain. The basic principles translate across most carbon-based life forms." What followed was 20 minutes of the kind of focused medical work that David found more natural than breathing. He coordinated triage, established treatment priorities, and provided immediate care while directing kitchen staff in supporting roles. His movements were economical and precise, his voice calm and reassuring as he explained procedures to injured patients in species they could understand. By the time the official medical team arrived from the Nexus's health center, David had stabilized all 3 patients, prevented the injuries from worsening, and somehow managed to restore enough order to the kitchen that dinner service could continue without major diplomatic incident. "Remarkable work," said the lead physician, a tall humanoid with green skin and extra joints in places that made David's anatomy training feel suddenly inadequate. "Your assessment and treatment protocols were exactly what the situation required." David was accepting congratulations and trying to deflect attention back to the kitchen staff who'd assisted him when he realized that someone was watching from the corridor doorway. Queen Ashera stood there with an expression of thoughtful curiosity, apparently having left the ceremony to investigate the disturbance personally. "You're with the Earth delegation," she said, approaching him with the kind of focused attention that made David suddenly aware that his dress uniform was now stained with alien medical supplies and his hair looked like he'd been in a windstorm. "Yes, Your Majesty." David Palmer, emergency medical technician. He attempted something that might have been a bow, though his experience with royal protocol was limited to half-remembered historical documentaries. "I apologize for leaving the ceremony, but—" "Don't apologize," Queen Ashera interrupted, her violet blue eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Tell me, Mr. Palmer, what made you decide to intervene?" David blinked, surprised by the question. "People were hurt. I had the training to help them." It seemed obvious. "Obvious," the Queen repeated, as if testing the word. "Not politically advantageous, not diplomatically strategic, not personally beneficial. Just obvious." "Well, yes. When someone needs help and you can provide it, you help them. That's—" David paused, realizing he was explaining basic human decency to someone who ruled a significant portion of the known galaxy. "I mean, that's how I was raised." Queen Ashera was quiet for a moment, and David became aware that their conversation had attracted an audience. Kitchen staff, medical personnel, and several members of the diplomatic escort were watching with the kind of fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents or natural disasters. "Mr. Palmer," the Queen said finally, "would you be willing to return to the assembly with me? I believe your perspective on courage might be illuminating for our gathered representatives." As they walked back toward the Grand Assembly Hall together, David still trying to process the fact that he was having a casual conversation with galactic royalty while covered in alien medical supplies. Queen Ashera asked him about his work, his training, and his thoughts on leadership under pressure. "Emergency medicine is about making quick decisions with incomplete information while people's lives hang in the balance," David explained, gratefully accepting a towel from a passing staff member to clean his hands. "You can't control the situation, you can only control your response to it. The courage isn't in not being afraid, it's in doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. And what needs to be done is always helping others. In my experience, yes. The specifics change, but the principle stays the same. You use whatever skills you have to protect whoever needs protection." They reached the assembly hall just as the formal presentations were concluding. Queen Ashera resumed her position before the gathered representatives while David attempted to slip back to his place among the Earth delegation, hoping his absence hadn't caused any diplomatic incidents. Honored representatives, Queen Ashera announced, her voice carrying a note of decision that made everyone in the hall pay attention. The traditional selection process has concluded without producing a suitable consort. Therefore, I am opening the selection to non-traditional candidates who may possess the qualities the Valerian Empire requires in its future leadership. The murmur of surprise that followed was interrupted by David Palmer raising his hand with the same automatic response that had sent him toward the kitchen emergency. Your Majesty, he said, his voice somehow carrying despite his complete lack of experience addressing galactic assemblies, I would like to volunteer. The silence that followed was profound enough that David could hear his own heartbeat. Then General Corvin began laughing, deep, rolling laughter that was quickly taken up by other warrior competitors and spread through the assembly like a contagion. The human medic? Corvin managed between bursts of derisive amusement. Your Majesty, surely you cannot be serious about considering a healer as consort to the galaxy's greatest warrior queen. David felt his face grow warm as the laughter continued, but he also felt something else, a steady certainty that had sustained him through years of emergency calls. He looked directly at Queen Ashera and saw something in her expression that might have been approval. General Corvin raises a fair point, Queen Ashera said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. Mr. Palmer, you have no military training, no combat experience, and no political background. What makes you believe you could be a suitable partner for the leader of a warrior civilization? David considered the question seriously, aware that his answer would determine whether this moment became an embarrassing anecdote or the beginning of something impossible. Your Majesty, he said, I don't know if I'd be suitable or not. But I know that courage isn't about winning fights. It's about running toward danger when other people are running away from it. It's about doing what's right even when it's difficult, even when it's thankless, even when no one will ever know you did it. He paused, looking around the assembly at faces that ranged from amused to incredulous to thoughtfully curious. I may not be a warrior, but I've spent my entire adult life trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. If that's not courage, then I don't understand what the word means. Queen Ashera studied him for a long moment while the assembly waited in suspense. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that ended debates before they could begin. Mr. David Palmer of Earth, she said formally, I accept your candidacy. We shall see what form of courage you possess, and whether it is indeed what the Valerian Empire needs. As the assembly erupted into chaos and David tried to process what he just committed himself to, he caught Queen Ashera's eye and saw something there that looked like hope mixed with anticipation. Whatever happened next, he realized, it was going to be far more interesting than his usual Tuesday night shift at Portland General Hospital. The Valerian testing facility looked like someone had crossed a military academy with a luxury resort and then asked a committee of warriors to decorate it with things that could efficiently kill people. David stood in the orientation chamber, wearing what he'd been told was adaptive combat gear, but felt more like a costume designed by someone who'd never met an actual human, watching Queen Ashera explain the traditional trials to an audience that clearly expected him to fail spectacularly. The trials of worthiness consist of 3 phases, she explained, her silver hair catching the light from holographic displays that showed previous competitions in somewhat terrifying detail. Combat simulation, survival challenge, and strategic warfare scenarios. Each is designed to test different aspects of the courage and competence required to lead the Valerian people. General Corvin stood nearby with the expression of someone watching a particularly entertaining form of slow-motion disaster. Your Majesty, perhaps we should modify the trials for our unique candidate. Standard protocols assume participants possess basic military training. The trials remain unchanged, Queen Ashera replied firmly. If Mr. Palmer wishes to be considered as my consort, he must prove himself according to Valerian standards. David raised his hand, a gesture that caused several warriors to snicker. Excuse me, Your Majesty, but could you define combat simulation? Because I should probably mention that my experience with violence is limited to restraining confused patients and that one time I had to tackle someone who was trying to steal an ambulance. Armed combat using traditional Valerian weapons, she answered, activating a holographic display that showed an impressive array of things designed to hurt people efficiently. Participants face increasingly difficult opponents until they achieve victory or... She paused delicately. Or until they're dead, General Corvin supplied helpfully. Though we do have excellent medical facilities. Right, David said, studying the holographic weapons and trying not to think about how his mother was going to react when she learned her son had died trying to court an alien queen with a sword. And the survival challenge? 72 hours alone on Kepler 442b, a hostile world with extreme weather conditions, predatory fauna, and limited resources, Queen Ashera explained. Participants must reach designated checkpoints while maintaining physical and psychological readiness for combat. David nodded thoughtfully. So it's like wilderness camping, but with things trying to eat me and no access to the outdoor store if I forget something important. That's not entirely inaccurate, the Queen admitted, and David thought he detected the hint of a smile before her expression returned to royal neutrality. The strategic warfare scenario proved to be the most intimidating of the three trials. David found himself in a war room surrounded by holographic displays showing fleet movements, resource distributions, and casualty projections for conflicts involving planets he'd never heard of and weapons that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Participants must develop and execute a campaign strategy to resolve the Altarian border conflict, Queen Ashera explained, gesturing at displays that showed two fleets positioned for what appeared to be mutual annihilation. Success is measured by achieving tactical objectives while minimizing casualties and resource expenditure. David studied the displays, his EMT training automatically focusing on the casualty projections. Your Majesty, I noticed these scenarios assume that military conflict is inevitable. What if there's a non-violent solution? General Corvin's laughter was sharp and dismissive. Mr. Palmer, this is a test of military strategy, not diplomatic fantasy. The Altarians have been raiding Valerian shipping lanes for months. They understand only strength. But what if they're raiding because they need something we could provide through negotiation? David persisted. I mean, in emergency medicine, we don't treat symptoms, we treat underlying causes. Maybe the raids are a symptom of a larger problem that could be solved without anyone dying. The silence that followed was broken by Queen Ashara's voice, carrying a note of genuine curiosity. Mr. Palmer, you're suggesting that military problems might have medical solutions? I'm suggesting that most conflicts happen because someone's needs aren't being met, and sometimes it's more efficient to meet those needs than to fight about them. David realized he was essentially trying to explain conflict resolution to people whose culture was built around winning battles, but he pressed on. In the ER, we see a lot of violence that stems from desperation, fear, or misunderstanding. Address the root cause, and the violence often stops on its own. The first trial began with David facing a holographic opponent wielding what appeared to be a sword made of concentrated starlight. His initial attempt at combat lasted approximately 12 seconds and ended with him lying on the training room floor, stunned but not actually injured thanks to the simulation's safety protocols. Perhaps, suggested the combat instructor, a scarred Valerian warrior named Captain Thane who looked like he'd been carved from granite and disappointment, we should start with basic weapon familiarization. What followed were several hours of David learning to hold various implements of destruction without immediately dropping them, cutting himself, or accidentally activating features that could level small buildings. His approach to swordsmanship confused the instructors, who kept trying to teach him aggressive techniques while he kept asking about defensive positions and ways to disarm opponents without seriously injuring them. Mr. Palmer, Captain Thane said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child, the objective in combat is to defeat your enemy, not to provide them with medical care. But what if defeating them means making sure they can't fight anymore without permanently damaging them? David asked, demonstrating a grip technique he'd improvised based on his knowledge of pressure points. In emergency medicine, we immobilize without causing additional trauma. Why should combat be different? The survival challenge proved equally unconventional. While other candidates raced toward checkpoints with the single-minded focus of predators pursuing prey, David established base camps with medical supply caches, built shelter structures designed to accommodate injured travelers, and spent considerable time studying the local ecosystem to understand which creatures were actually dangerous versus those that simply looked intimidating. His progress was slower than traditional candidates, but Queen Ashera, monitoring from the orbital command center, noticed that he was the only participant who hadn't suffered any significant injuries. Other candidates arrived at checkpoints bloodied, exhausted, and psychologically stressed from fighting their way through hostile terrain. David arrived rested, well-fed, and carrying detailed notes about local flora that could be used for medical purposes. "He's treating it like a research expedition," observed Commander Hayes, the Earth diplomatic liaison who'd been invited to monitor the trials. "He's not trying to conquer the environment, he's trying to understand it." "Is that courage or foolishness?" General Corvin asked. "Maybe both," Queen Ashera replied, watching David carefully extract venom from a local predator for what appeared to be analytical purposes rather than self-defense. "Or maybe it's a form of bravery we don't recognize because we've never seen it before." The strategic warfare scenario provided the most unexpected results. Faced with the Altarian border conflict simulation, David spent his first 4 hours ignoring the military displays entirely and instead researching Altarian culture, resource distribution, and recent political developments. When the other candidates were already deep into fleet deployment strategies, David was still reading anthropological reports. "Mr. Palmer," General Corvin finally interrupted, "you're aware that this is a timed exercise?" "Yes, sir. I'm just trying to understand why the Altarians are raiding Valerian shipping instead of pursuing normal trade relationships." David pulled up a series of data displays that showed economic conditions in Altarian space. "Look at this, they're experiencing massive crop failures due to solar radiation fluctuations. Their raids aren't territorial expansion, they're desperate attempts to acquire food and medical supplies. And how does that information help you defeat them militarily?" General Corvin pressed. "It doesn't. But it might help me solve their problem, which would end the conflict without anyone getting defeated." David began coordinating what appeared to be a supply mission rather than a military strike. "If we provide emergency food aid and technical assistance with radiation shielding, they won't need to raid our ships anymore." The simulation results were unlike anything in Valerian military history. David's strategy ended the conflict in 8 days with 0 casualties, established a profitable trade relationship with the Altarians, and somehow resulted in them volunteering to serve as allies against mutual threats. The traditional military strategies achieved victory but at the cost of thousands of lives and ongoing hostility that would require continuous military presence to manage. During their first private conversation after the trials, Queen Ashera found David in the medical bay, treating minor injuries sustained by other candidates during their combat simulations. "You realize," she said, settling into a chair beside his impromptu treatment station, "that you've failed every trial by traditional measures?" "I know," David replied, carefully bandaging a plasma burn on a Chronarian warrior who'd been too proud to seek official medical attention. "I'm not really warrior material. I'm more of a fix things that are broken person than a break things efficiently person." "And yet," Queen Ashera continued, "you've also achieved results that none of our traditional candidates could match. The combat instructors report that you've developed defensive techniques they'd never considered. The survival challenge revealed new approaches to hostile environment management. And your strategic solution to the Altarian conflict." She paused, watching him work. It was remarkable. David looked up from his patient, meeting her violet blue eyes directly. "Your Majesty, can I ask you something that might be inappropriate? Given that you're currently courting me while covered in alien medical supplies, I think we've already crossed the line into inappropriate territory. What kind of courage do you actually need? Not what tradition says you need, but what you personally need in a partner." Queen Ashera was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the kind of serious attention she usually reserved for military strategy. I need someone who can protect what matters without destroying what makes it worth protecting. I need someone who can face danger without becoming dangerous, who can make difficult decisions without losing compassion. She met his eyes directly. I need someone who runs toward problems instead of away from them, even when, especially when, those problems can't be solved with weapons. David finished bandaging his patient and carefully cleaned his hands before responding. Your Majesty, that sounds less like a warrior and more like a healer. Yes, Queen Ashera said softly, it does. As they sat together in the medical bay, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of problems solved and injuries healed, David began to understand that his unconventional approach to the trials might not have been failures after all. Maybe, just maybe, the galaxy's most feared warrior queen was looking for something that couldn't be found in traditional places. The announcement that Queen Ashera was seriously considering David Palmer as her consort triggered the kind of political crisis that made galactic historians reach for stronger coffee and longer deadlines. Within hours of the news breaking, the Valerian High Council had convened an emergency session. 3 different military factions had issued strongly worded statements about tradition and strength, and someone had apparently started a betting pool on how long the human would survive formal consideration. David discovered all of this while attempting to enjoy what he'd hoped would be a quiet breakfast in the diplomatic quarters, only to find Ambassador Zhang pacing the length of their shared suite with the expression of someone calculating the odds of preventing an interstellar incident through pure willpower. David, Zhang said without preamble, we need to discuss your diplomatic status. I have diplomatic status. You have something. The Valerian High Council is referring to you as either the anomalous candidate or the human irregularity, depending on how formal they're feeling. Zhang paused his pacing to study David with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle involving explosive materials. 3 Earth news networks are demanding interviews. The Altarian embassy has sent a fruit basket with a note saying you're surprisingly practical for a human, and someone from the Cronarian delegation wants to adopt you as an honorary battle brother. That's a lot to process before coffee. It gets worse. General Corvin has petitioned the High Council to invoke the Trial of Valor, a formal challenge designed to test whether potential consorts possess the physical courage worthy of Valerian royalty. Zhang's expression grew grim. David, this isn't like the training exercises you've been doing. The Trial of Valor involves real combat with real weapons against opponents who are genuinely trying to kill you. David absorbed this information while mechanically spreading jam on his toast, a process that suddenly seemed far more appealing than contemplating his own violent demise. Can I refuse? Technically, yes. But refusing would end your candidacy and possibly destabilize Queen Ashara's political position. The military faction is using your relationship with her to question her judgment and leadership capabilities. So my choices are getting killed in ritual combat or causing a political crisis that could damage the woman I'm trying to court. That's an accurate summary, yes. David considered his options while finishing his breakfast, trying to apply emergency medical. The announcement that Queen Ashera was seriously considering David Palmer as her consort triggered the kind of political crisis that made galactic historians reach for stronger coffee and longer deadlines. Within hours of the news breaking, the Valerian High Council had convened an emergency session. 3 different military factions had issued strongly worded statements about tradition and strength, and someone had apparently started a betting pool on how long the human would survive formal consideration. David discovered all of this while attempting to enjoy what he'd hoped would be a quiet breakfast in the diplomatic quarters, only to find Ambassador Zhang pacing the length of their shared suite with the expression of someone calculating the odds of preventing an interstellar incident through pure willpower. David, Zhang said without preamble, we need to discuss your diplomatic status. I have diplomatic status. You have something. The Valerian High Council is referring to you as either the anomalous candidate or the human irregularity, depending on how formal they're feeling. Zhang paused his pacing to study David with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle involving explosive materials. 3 Earth news networks are demanding interviews. The Altarian embassy has sent a fruit basket with a note saying you're surprisingly practical for a human, and someone from the Cronarian delegation wants to adopt you as an honorary battle brother. That's a lot to process before coffee. It gets worse. General Corvin has petitioned the High Council to invoke the Trial of Valor, a formal challenge designed to test whether potential consorts possess the physical courage worthy of Valerian royalty. Zhang's expression grew grim. David, this isn't like the training exercises you've been doing. The Trial of Valor involves real combat with real weapons against opponents who are genuinely trying to kill you. David absorbed this information while mechanically spreading jam on his toast, a process that suddenly seemed far more appealing than contemplating his own violent demise. Can I refuse? Technically, yes. But refusing would end your candidacy and possibly destabilize Queen Ashara's political position. The military faction is using your relationship with her to question her judgment and leadership capabilities. So my choices are getting killed in ritual combat or causing a political crisis that could damage the woman I'm trying to court. That's an accurate summary, yes. David considered his options while finishing his breakfast, trying to apply emergency medical reasoning to a situation that seemed designed to resist logical solutions. In the ER, impossible cases usually had unexpected angles that became obvious once you stopped trying to solve the problem the way everyone expected it to be solved. Zhang, he said finally, what exactly are the rules for this trial of valor? Single combat in the ancient arena, weapons of the challenger's choice, victory by defeat of the opponent or surrender. Zhang consulted his notes with the expression of someone reading a medical prognosis he didn't want to deliver. Traditional duration is until one combatant is incapacitated or yields. But what defines defeat? And who determines the conditions of victory? I actually don't know. The regulations were written in Old Valerian about 3,000 years ago, and apparently no one's needed to consult the fine print recently. David found Queen Ashera in the palace's strategy room, surrounded by holographic displays showing troop movements and resource allocations that suggested the Valerian Empire was dealing with multiple simultaneous crises. She looked up as he entered, her violet-blue eyes reflecting the kind of exhaustion that came from trying to hold a warrior civilization together through sheer force of will. David, she said, dismissing the displays with a gesture, I assume you've heard about General Corvin's petition. I have. I'm also assuming you can't simply refuse it without political consequences. The military faction is already questioning my judgment for considering a non-warrior as consort. If I appear to be protecting you from traditional tests of courage. She trailed off, but David could see the calculations in her expression. It would look like I'm weak and you're compromised by personal feelings. Exactly. Queen Ashera moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns etched into her crystalline armor. David, I want you to know that you can withdraw your candidacy without any shame. This trial wasn't designed for someone with your background and training. What if I don't want to withdraw? Then you'll be facing Talon, General Corvin's chosen champion, in single combat with traditional weapons. Her voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she was trying not to influence his decision while simultaneously dreading his answer. Talon has never lost a formal challenge. He's 7 feet tall, trained from childhood in 17 different combat disciplines, and has a personal philosophy that views mercy as a character defect. David considered this information while studying Queen Ashara's face, looking for the same kind of subtle indicators he used to assess patients who weren't telling him the complete truth about their symptoms. Ashera, may I call you Ashera, what would happen if I won? If you won, she said carefully, it would legitimize your candidacy and demonstrate that human courage, however unconventional, meets Valerian standards. And if I lost? If you lost, you would likely die, and I would be expected to choose a consort from the remaining traditional candidates. Her composure cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like genuine fear beneath the royal authority. David, I don't want you to die proving a point about the nature of courage. Then I guess I'll have to not die, David said with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. But I'm going to need some help understanding the specific rules of this trial. What followed was the most intensive crash course in ancient Valerian law that anyone had attempted since the regulations were first written. David, Queen Ashera, and a hastily assembled team of legal scholars spent 3 days parsing archaic language and cultural references that hadn't been relevant for centuries. The interesting thing, observed scholar Vithin, an elderly Valerian whose silver hair had achieved the kind of luminescent quality that suggested deep wisdom or possible radiation exposure, is that the original trial of valor wasn't designed to test combat prowess. It was intended to identify leaders who could protect Valerian society from all forms of threat. What's the difference? David asked. Combat prowess focuses on defeating enemies. Protection focuses on preserving what matters, regardless of the methods required. Scholar Vithin pulled up translations that made David's head hurt just looking at them. The trial's victory conditions are surprisingly flexible: defeat of the opponent, yes, but also demonstration of superior courage in service of Valerian welfare. So victory doesn't necessarily mean killing the other person? Technically, no. Though in practice, most trials have ended with the death or surrender of one combatant. David spent his remaining preparation time doing something that confused everyone involved in training him. Instead of focusing on weapons techniques or combat strategies, he studied Valerian medical practices, emergency response protocols, and the biographical information available about his opponent, Talon. David, Queen Ashera said during their final private conversation before the trial, "I need to know, are you doing this because you believe you can win, or because you believe it's the right thing to do regardless of the outcome?" "Honestly, I'm doing it because I've never met anyone like you, and I want to find out what we could build together if we had the chance." David met her eyes directly, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their shifting colors. "I can't promise I'll win. But I can promise that whatever happens tomorrow, I'll do everything I can to prove that your faith in me wasn't misplaced." The night before the trial, David received visits from an unexpected collection of supporters. The kitchen staff brought him a meal prepared with ingredients from 12 different worlds, each dish designed to provide strength and good fortune according to various cultural traditions. The medical team offered him stimulants, pain suppressors, and healing compounds that would give him advantages in combat. Ambassador Zhang arrived with official messages from Earth's leadership, formal diplomatic protests, and unofficial advice about where to aim for maximum damage. David declined the drugs, thanked everyone for their support, and spent his final evening. The ancient arena of the Valerian Empire had witnessed 3 millennia of single combat, ritual challenges, and demonstrations of martial prowess that had shaped the destiny of entire star systems. It had never witnessed someone setting down their weapon and opening a medical kit while facing the Empire's most feared champion, which probably explained why the crowd's reaction involved several seconds of confused silence followed by what could only be described as bewildered murmuring. Champion Talon paused in his attack posture, his massive frame frozen between aggressive advance and genuine confusion. "Human," he rumbled in a voice like grinding stone, "you are required to defend yourself. Surrendering without combat brings dishonor to both participants." "I'm not surrendering," David replied, pulling on medical gloves with the same calm focus he brought to emergency calls. "I'm examining my opponent for injury assessment." "You're what? Talon, right? Champion of the Valerian military, veteran of 18 formal challenges, winner of the Cronarian War Games." David approached with the steady, non-threatening movements he used with agitated patients in the ER. "I've been studying your combat record, and I noticed something concerning." General Corvin's voice boomed across the arena. "Palmer. This is single combat, not a medical consultation." "Actually," David called back, never taking his eyes off Talon. According to scholar Vithin's translation of the original trial protocols, victory is defined as demonstration of superior courage in service of Valerian welfare. I'd argue that ensuring our greatest champion's long-term health serves Valerian welfare better than defeating him through violence. Talon's weapon lowered slightly as he processed this interpretation. "You believe you can demonstrate superior courage through medical treatment?" "I believe you've been fighting through chronic pain from a lower back injury for the past 3 years, compensating with altered movement patterns that are going to cause permanent damage if left untreated." David gestured toward Talon's stance, using his EMT training to read the subtle indicators of injury. "Your left side guard position is compromised, you're favoring your right leg during lateral movement, and you're probably experiencing recurring muscle spasms that you've been treating with pain suppressors instead of addressing the underlying structural problem. The arena fell silent as thousands of spectators tried to process the unprecedented spectacle of someone conducting a medical diagnosis during ritual combat. In the royal viewing box, Queen Ashera leaned forward with an expression of fascination mixed with concern. Talon stared at David for a long moment, his massive frame radiating the kind of dangerous confusion that usually preceded either violence or nervous breakdowns. "How did you know about the injury?" "Because I've spent 10 years treating people who push their bodies beyond safe limits for professional reasons," David replied, maintaining his calm, clinical tone. "Paramedics, firefighters, construction workers, professional athletes, they all develop the same compensation patterns when they're too dedicated to their work to prioritize their own health. And you believe this, medical knowledge, represents superior courage? Talon, you've been risking permanent disability to fulfill your duties as champion. That's incredibly brave, but it's also incredibly dangerous, not just to you, but to the empire that depends on your protection." David opened his medical kit and began laying out supplies with practiced efficiency. Real courage isn't just about accepting personal risk. It's about minimizing unnecessary risk so you can be available when your people really need you. General Corvin's outraged voice cut through the arena's stunned quiet. "This is a violation of every tradition governing formal combat. Champion Talon, you are required to engage." But Champion Talon was studying David with the expression of someone encountering a completely new type of problem. "You're suggesting that allowing you to treat my injury would demonstrate courage rather than weakness?" "I'm suggesting that acknowledging pain doesn't make you weak, ignoring it when it compromises your effectiveness makes you weak." David held up a device that looked like a cross between a diagnostic scanner and a sophisticated massage tool. "This is a portable muscle relaxer with structural alignment capabilities. 5 minutes of treatment could restore full range of motion to your guard positions and eliminate the compensatory stress you've been putting on your joints." The crowd's murmur grew louder as spectators debated whether they were witnessing revolutionary courage or elaborate cowardice. In the royal box, Queen Ashera rose from her seat with an expression of dawning understanding. "Citizens of the Empire," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the arena, "we are witnessing something unprecedented. Champion Talon faces a choice between traditional combat and accepting medical care that could extend his career and better serve our people's defense. The question is, which choice demonstrates greater courage?" Talon considered this for a moment, then made a decision that would be remembered in Valerian military history for generations. He set down his weapon and lay flat on the arena floor. "Human medic," he said formally, "I accept your treatment." What followed was the most unusual victory in the history of Valerian trial combat. David worked with focused professional efficiency, using advanced medical techniques to address muscle tension, joint alignment, and structural compensation patterns that had been limiting Talon's combat effectiveness for years. The arena's viewing screens displayed his work in detail, and David provided running commentary about human emergency medicine, cross-species physiology, and the importance of preventive care for high-performance individuals. "The fascinating thing about chronic pain management," David explained while working on Talon's lower back, "is that most people think courage means fighting through the pain. But actually, courage means admitting when something is wrong and taking steps to fix it before it becomes unfixable." Talon, who had been silent during most of the treatment, finally spoke as David finished the adjustment procedure. "Palmer," he said quietly, "in 30 years of military service, no one has ever suggested that acknowledging injury could be a form of strength. That's because military culture teaches you to ignore problems until they become catastrophic," David replied, helping Talon to his feet. "Medical culture teaches you to solve problems before they become catastrophic. Both approaches require courage, but only one of them keeps you functional long-term." Talon stood slowly, testing his range of motion with the expression of someone discovering that they'd been living with unnecessary limitations. His movement patterns showed immediate improvement, his stance was more balanced, his guard positions more fluid, and his expression carried a kind of wonder that suggested he'd forgotten what it felt like to move without pain. This is. Talon paused, rotating his shoulders experimentally, remarkable. I had no idea how much the injury was affecting my performance. Most people don't, until they experience what normal feels like again. David began packing his medical supplies with the satisfaction of a job well done. You should probably follow up with regular maintenance treatments, avoid overextending your back during combat rotations, and consider whether the Empire's medical protocols for champions might need updating. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything in the arena's 3,000-year history. Instead of cheers for victory or respectful silence for defeat, there was an excited buzz of conversation as spectators tried to process what they'd witnessed. Someone had just won a trial of valor through medical treatment, demonstrated courage by providing care rather than inflicting damage, and somehow made the Empire's greatest champion more effective by refusing to fight him. General Corvin stood in his viewing box with the expression of someone watching fundamental assumptions about reality collapse in real time. This is not how trials of valor are supposed to conclude. No, Queen Ashera agreed, descending from the royal box to join David and Talon on the arena floor, it's not. But perhaps that's exactly why it's important. She approached David with the kind of regal grace that made even his post-adrenaline exhaustion feel somehow formal. David Palmer of Earth, she said, her voice carrying across the arena, you have demonstrated a form of courage that our traditions do not recognize but our empire desperately needs, the courage to solve problems rather than defeat enemies, to strengthen allies rather than destroy opponents, to protect through healing rather than through violence. Talon stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace of someone whose chronic pain had just been eliminated. Your Majesty, he said formally, I endorse this candidate's worthiness. He has proven that true strength lies not in the ability to cause harm, but in the wisdom to prevent it. The political crisis that had threatened to destabilize the empire resolved itself in the most unexpected way possible, through overwhelming popular support for David's approach to the trial. Representatives from dozens of worlds requested information about human medical techniques, warrior societies began reconsidering their approaches to injury management, and someone apparently started a movement to establish medical training requirements for all military champions. 6 months later, David Palmer and Queen Ashera were married in a ceremony that combined Valerian military tradition with human medical ethics, resulting in the first royal wedding in galactic history where the vows included promises to heal together what neither could heal alone. Their partnership transformed the Empire's approach to leadership, establishing medical corps alongside military units and proving that the courage to care for others was just as valuable as the courage to fight for them. Standing together in the palace's medical center, which had become David's unofficial office and Ashera's favorite place to find him when royal duties allowed, they watched as Valerian and human medical students worked together to develop cross-species emergency protocols. You know, Ashera said, reviewing reports about the Empire's dramatically improved injury recovery rates since implementing David's medical recommendations, when I announced that I needed a courageous consort, I never imagined that courage would look like this. Like what? David asked, looking up from a patient file involving a Cronarian diplomat who'd somehow managed to dislocate 3 joints that didn't exist in human anatomy. Like someone brave enough to redefine what strength means, wise enough to solve problems that everyone else thought were unsolvable, and foolish enough to volunteer for something he had no business attempting. Ashera moved closer, her silver hair catching the light from the medical equipment in patterns that still made David's heart skip beats. Like someone who stepped forward when no one expected him to, and changed everything by refusing to be what everyone thought he should be. David considered this while reviewing treatment notes that somehow involved both plasma burns and interdimensional parasites. Your Majesty, I think you're giving me too much credit. I just did what seemed obvious at the time. David, she said, using the tone that meant she was about to say something important, that's exactly why it was courageous. As they worked together to establish the first intergalactic medical corps, combining Valerian tactical efficiency with human healing arts to create emergency response teams that could handle crises across multiple star systems, David reflected on the journey from reluctant volunteer to imperial consort. His willingness to step forward when no one expected him to maintain his principles under pressure, and to redefine success in terms of lives protected rather than enemies defeated, had proven that sometimes the most surprising thing about courage is how quietly it can change the universe.